Abortion, letting die, expulsion, and unaliving. A philosophical dialogue. The following is a dialogue between two interlocutors, Mira, who defends the permissibility of abortion on expulsion grounds, and Theo, who presses the argument with critical scrutiny. Neither character represents a fixed ideological position. Both are committed to following the argument wherever it leads. Theo, let me start with what seems like common ground. Most people accept that you have the right to remove an uninvited guest from your home, even forcibly if necessary. What most people resist is the idea that you may kill the guest in the process of removing them. Is that a fair starting point? Mira, it is. And I think it captures something important about why abortion is not straightforwardly analogous to homicide. The act at issue is expulsion, the termination of a relationship of bodily dependence, not the deliberate ending of a life. Theo. But the fetus dies. That outcome is not incidental to the procedure. It is, in many cases, a direct result of the method used. How does the language of expulsion survive that fact? Mira, through a distinction between what is intended and what is foreseen. The purpose of the procedure is to end the pregnancy, to relieve the pregnant person of the burdens that pregnancy imposes. Fetal death, where it occurs, is a consequence of the fetus's inability to survive outside the womb at that stage of development. It is not the mechanism by which the pregnancy ends. Theo, you're invoking the doctrine of double effect. Mira, in part, yes. The doctrine asks us to distinguish between what an agent aims at, the intended effect, and what the agent merely foresees as a side consequence of the act. A surgeon who administers high doses of morphine to a terminal patient, knowing it may hasten death, is not thereby a killer if the intent is pain relief. We extend moral latitude, based on what the agent is actually trying to bring about. Theo, I accept that the doctrine has real work to do in ethics, but one of its central conditions is that the bad effect not be the means to the good effect. That is, fetal death cannot be the instrument by which the pregnancy ends. Is that satisfied here? Mira, in the expulsion framing, yes. The pregnancy ends because the fetus is no longer housed in and sustained by the pregnant person's body. That separation is the operative event. Death follows from the fetus's condition, its developmental stage, its incapacity for independent life, not from anything the procedure does to the fetus as such. Theo, that description may be more comfortable than accurate. Consider the actual methods employed in early termination. Mifepristone and misoprostol work in part by creating uterine contractions that expel the embryo. But the embryo is already dying by the time expulsion occurs. The drug acts on the pregnancy itself. The fetal organism is not expelled alive, and then left to perish independently. It is, in a relevant sense, already being destroyed. Doesn't this collapse the distinction? Mira, I think you have the pharmacology somewhat wrong, and the correction matters morely. Mifepristone is a progesterone receptor antagonist. What it does is block the hormonal signal that the pregnant person's body is continuously sending to sustain the pregnancy. Progesterone is not produced by the fetus, it is produced by the corpus luteum, and later the placenta as part of the pregnant person's own physiology. Mifepristone interrupts that endogenous sustaining function. It is, in the most literal sense, an unplugging, a withdrawal of the biological support system, not an act directed at the fetus. Theo. But the fetus dies as a result. Mira, yes, just as the violinist dies when you disconnect the machinery. The question the expulsion argument poses is whether the act is best described as attacking the fetus, or ceasing to sustain it. Mifepristone clearly does the latter. It does not cross the placenta in pharmacologically significant amounts. It does not act on fetal tissue. It acts on the maternal hormonal environment that the pregnancy requires. The fetus's death follows from the withdrawal of that environment, not from any direct intervention on the fetus itself. That is precisely the structure the expulsion argument needs. Theo, and misoprostol? Mira, misoprostol induces uterine contractions that expel the pregnancy. Again, this is the mechanics of expulsion, not of targeted killing. The contractions act on the uterus, not the fetus. One might object that the physical process of expulsion at early gestational stages is violent enough that fetal death is inseparable from it, but that is an objection about the harshness of the method, not its moral description. The intent and mechanism remain oriented toward removal of the pregnancy from the body, not destruction of fetal life as such. Theo, so you're arguing that the two-drug regimen is, by its own pharmacological logic, a closer approximation of the expulsion model than it might appear. Mira, precisely. Mifepristone withdraws sustenance, misoprostol effectuates expulsion. Neither drug is directed at the fetus as a target. If you are looking for the clearest real-world instantiation of the philosophical distinction between killing and letting die through withdrawal of support, medication abortion is arguably a better example than many of the thought experiments philosophers use, including The Violinist, where the unplugging is stipulated rather than mechanistically described. Theo, what is the underlying moral principle? State it as cleanly as you can. Mira, that no person can be compelled to sustain another's life with their body against their will, and that acting to end such compelled sustenance, even knowing that the other will not survive the cessation, does not constitute an act of killing in the morally relevant sense. The wrong of killing is bound up with the targeting of a life as an end, or as a means. Expulsion does neither. Theo, here is where I want to press you. You say the wrong of killing is bound up with targeting a life. But there is another account of what makes killing wrong, one associated with Don Marquis, which locates the wrong not in the agent's intention, but in what is taken from the victim, the loss of a future of value. On that account, intention is beside the point. The fetus loses its future regardless of whether you call the act expulsion. Mira, that account has its own difficulties. It would seem to prohibit contraception, and, on some readings, any act that forecloses a possible person. But setting that aside, even if we accept that the fetus has a future of value, the question is whose obligation it is to sustain that future. The existence of a morally significant interest on one side does not automatically generate a duty on another. We do not ordinarily think that one person's need for sustenance obligates another person to provide it with their body. Theo, Thompson's Violinist. Mira, precisely. The right not to be killed and the right to be kept alive are not the same right. Even if the fetus has the former, it does not automatically possess the latter, not at the expense of another's bodily integrity. Theo, let me try a different pressure point. Suppose ectogenesis becomes available, an artificial womb capable of gestating a fetus to term. In that scenario, expulsion need not entail death. The fetus could be transferred rather than terminated. Does your argument then imply that abortion, as the deliberate ending of fetal life, becomes impermissible, even if the pregnant person retains the right to expulsion? Mira, that is the most serious challenge to the expulsion argument, and I will not pretend it is easy. If the argument is purely about bodily autonomy, and the right to expel, then yes, it seems to imply that transfer, not termination, would be the required form of expulsion where transfer is possible. The pregnant person's burden is ended. The fetus survives. Theo, does that conclusion sit comfortably with you? Mira, it sits uncomfortably, which may suggest that something more than expulsion is doing the moral work in the pro-choice position, something like an interest in not being the cause of a new person's existence, or in controlling one's reproductive trajectory in a stronger sense than mere bodily separation captures. But I am not certain whether that additional interest is weighty enough to ground a right to termination specifically, as opposed to expulsion. Theo, or it may suggest that the expulsion framing, while capturing something real about bodily autonomy, is not the full story, that the moral permissibility of abortion, where it exists, rests on a more complex set of considerations than any single principle can supply. Mira, that I can accept. The expulsion argument is not meant to be a complete account. It is meant to demonstrate that abortion, as an act, is not straightforwardly equivalent to homicide, that the intention structure, the act description, and the rights at stake are different in morally significant ways. Whether that demonstration is sufficient to settle the question of permissibility is another matter. Theo, then perhaps that is where we leave it. The expulsion argument succeeds in dislodging the simple equation of abortion with killing in most, but maybe not all cases, but it does not by itself establish the full permissibility of every act of termination in every circumstance. The argument opens space, it does not fill it. Mira, agreed. And perhaps that is the honest philosophical position, to resist false certainty in both directions. The dialogue above is intended as a philosophical instrument, not an advocacy document. Readers are invited to identify where they find the reasoning compelling, where they find it wanting, and what additional considerations they believe the argument requires. Philosophical principles and thinkers implicit in discussion are worthy of exploring. 1. Principle of non-assistance. Joel Feinberg, Judith Thomson, Scanlon. Core idea: a person may have a duty not to harm, but no duty to provide life-sustaining aid, especially when the aid requires bodily sacrifice. Why it fits. Mira's claim that no person can be compelled to sustain another's life with their body is a direct application of Feinberg's distinction between positive and negative duties. Relevant philosophers. Feinberg, duties of rescue versus duties of non-interference. Scanlon, reasonable rejection of principles requiring extreme sacrifice. Thomson, Violinist, is a paradigmatic non-assistance case. Use in the dialogue. It clarifies that the moral question is not may you kill, but may you refuse to provide bodily life support? 2. Doctrine of doing versus allowing, Philippa Foot, Warren Quinn. Core idea: there is a morally relevant difference between doing harm and allowing harm. Why it fits. Mira's distinction between withdrawing support and killing is exactly Foot's distinction. Philosophers. Philippa Foot. Original articulation Warren Quinn. Direct agency versus indirect agency. Use in the dialogue. Medication abortion is framed as allowing death through withdrawal of support, not doing death through direct attack. 3. Principle of non-instrumentality, Kant, Scanlon, Quinn. Core idea: it is impermissible to use a person's body as a mere means to sustain another. Why it fits. Theo's challenge about targeting life is answered by Mira's claim that the fetus's death is not the means to ending pregnancy. Philosophers. Kant, humanity is an end in itself. Scanlon, principles no one could reasonably reject. Quinn, harm as a means versus harm as a side effect. Use in the dialogue. Pregnancy cannot morally conscript a body as a life support machine. 4. Principle of bodily self-ownership, Loka, Judith Thomson, Robert Nozick. Core idea: individuals have a strong moral claim over the use of their own bodies. Why it fits. Mira's argument is a direct application of bodily self-ownership. The body cannot be requisitioned without consent. Philosophers. Locke, foundational self-ownership. Nozick, inviolability of persons. Thomson, bodily autonomy as the core of abortion permissibility. 5. Principle of non-creation duties, David Boonin, Elizabeth Harmon. Core idea: one may have no duty to bring a future person into existence or sustain the conditions for their existence. Why it fits. Mira's discomfort with ectogenesis reveals an implicit appeal to non-creation rights, the right not to be the cause of a new person's existence. Philosophers. Boonin, permissibility of abortion even if fetus has rights. Harmon, actual future principle. Use in the dialogue. This principle explains why transfer to ectogenesis may still feel morally burdensome. 6. Moral status as gradualist, Mary Ann Warren, Jeff McMahon. Core idea: moral status increases with psychological development, not instantaneously at conception. Why it fits. The dialogue doesn't explicitly take a stance on fetal moral status, but the expulsion argument leaves room for doubt that early fetuses have full personhood. Philosophers. Warren, criteria for personhood. McMahon, time-relative interest account. Use in the dialogue. Helps explain why early expulsion is morally different from killing a developed person. 7. Principle of reasonable burden, Scanlon, Nussbaum. Core idea: a moral requirement cannot impose unreasonable or extreme burdens on one party to benefit another. Why it fits. Pregnancy is an extreme, unique, and continuous bodily burden. Philosophers. Scanlon, contractualism. Nussbaum, capabilities and bodily integrity. Use in the dialogue. Supports the claim that sustaining pregnancy cannot be morally mandatory. 8. Moral asymmetry between causing and preventing life, Parfit, Kafka. Core idea: a moral difference between causing a life and allowing a life not to continue. Why it fits. This principle abuts Mira's claim that ending support is not equivalent to killing. Philosophers. Derek Parfit, non-identity problem. Gregory Kafka, procreation ethics. 9. Principle of moral clean hands, Bernard Williams. Core idea: agents are not morally required to participate in actions that violate their integrity or identity, particularly if those telling them to are ones which have done the action already. Don't steal, says the thief with riches. Why it fits. Pregnancy can be framed as a morally loaded participation in creating a person, something one may refuse. Philosophers. Williams, integrity and moral agency. 10. Principle of agent-centered permissions, Samuel Scheffler. Core idea: moral agents are permitted to give special weight to their own interests, even when others have morally significant claims. Why it fits. Pregnancy is a paradigmatic case where agent-centered permissions matter. Philosophers. Scheffler, permissions to favor oneself. Summary of denoted principles. Doing versus allowing harm. Foot, Quinn. Non-assistance principle, Feinberg, Thomson. Non-instrumentality, Kant, Scanlon. Self-ownership, Loka, Nozick. Reasonable burden, Scanlon, Nussbaum. Gradualist moral status, Warren, McMahon. Non-creation duties, Boonin, Harmon. Agent-centered permissions, Scheffler. Moral integrity, Williams. Asymmetry of causing versus preventing life, Parfit, Kafka. Bonus: least harmful means principle, a long-standing medical ethics principle that was developed further by the likes of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Also a relevant theory which uses other principled commitments. Evictionism is a libertarian philosophical framework that addresses the abortion debate by treating a woman's womb as her private property. Theorist Walter Block and philosopher Roy Whitehead